I'm Ari Gronich, and this is Create a New Tomorrow podcast. Welcome back to another episode of Create a New Tomorrow. I'm your host, Ari Gronich, and I am back with Kyle Davies from Wales. He was on the show before. I had to keep talking to him, longer conversation, because he's so fascinating. He's a chartered psychologist, therapist, coach, trainer, author, and he's the creator of Energy Flow Coaching, which provides a framework and process for tapping into our innate ability to attain optimum health, well-being, creativity, and clarity of mind. Kyle, take it away a little bit. Tell us a little bit about how come I'm having you back on here? I mean, what is so fascinating about the work that you do that is so unusual that I would say, hey, I need you to come back?
It's great to be back. Thanks for having me again. And you've really put me on the spot there. It's funny, we're definitely living in a time where there are more healers and healing modalities than ever before in history. And there's obviously a lot of good people out there doing a lot of good work. And I lose track of everything that's out there. Go back kind of 20, 25 years, when I started practicing as a therapist, I kind of thought I knew everything that was out there. I had a handle on it. Whereas now it's just kind of mushroomed really, and there are so many things out there. But what's sort of unique about what I do? I'm sure it's probably the way I do it. I'm sure there's a lot of overlap in many ways. I think it's probably because I'm in a very simple level, I am looking at, as I touched on in the last show, that I'm looking at when people experience symptoms of fatigue or pain, even anxiety and depression, I'm looking at them from a perspective of it's a body and brain in a chronic state of stress. But I actually look at it from this idea that, right, well, the symptom is a messenger. And if you experience a severe symptom, it's actually your body's really shouting at you. So the simplest of examples could be, if my body needs me to eat, it sends me a sensation in the form of very often a mild rumbling, and that's a tap on the shoulder inviting me to do something. If I ignore that, it goes away and then it comes back. And I can continue to ignore it, but it'll keep coming back. And each time it comes back, arguably it'll be a little bit more intense, or it may change or morph into something else. So I take that idea and apply it to the symptoms of the health challenges that I'm working with. There's an underlying message behind a symptom, and it's not necessarily that as if the symptom has, or the symptoms have morphed, changed, or got worse over time, it's not necessarily that the message is any different. So I have a book called The Intelligent Body, which is I've got nicely positioned behind my head there, and in that I talk about something called what I see as the hallway of health. And the hallway of health effectively means that people walk down a hallway, and as they walk down that hallway, symptoms seem to get worse or more intense. So what I noticed in working with people with chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, ME, post-viral fatigue, is that they weren't kind of perfectly healthy, and then all of a sudden they got those challenges. For the most part, what it seemed like was that they, when much younger, they would present with a variety of other symptoms. So very often people would say, well, I'm 45 now, I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue 3 years ago, and I probably had symptoms maybe a couple of years before that. And if we dig a little bit deeper, they may say, well, actually, when I was 15, I used to get migraines. But then I went to the doctor, and the doctor gave me some meds, so that went away. And then when I was a student, I began to get some anxiety and some occasional stomach upset. But I sort of changed my diet a bit, and I don't know, things changed, and that went away. And then when I began to get fatigue symptoms, and then a bit of the anxiety came back. So that tends to be a pattern. From the way I looked at it was that people were walking down a hallway, and even though I do acknowledge that all of these conditions are sort of different, I do kind of believe that in many instances the message is largely the same. And even though symptoms could change for an individual, sometimes they don't. Sometimes a person experiences anxiety age 15, and age 45 they still have anxiety, it's just maybe much worse. But it could be that the symptoms change as they get older. And again, like hunger, there seems to be this cyclic kind of nature where symptoms come and then they recede and then they come back again, and either a little bit more intense, or they vary. And it is almost as if the body is saying, you need to listen to me, you need to listen to the message that I'm trying to convey, and if you don't, I'm going to shout at you a little bit louder. So that's one of the things. So then I suppose we are in with our medicalized mindset, we tend to view symptoms as bad, evil invaders that we want to do something about. And we have a very symptom focused approach, which is, again, from conventional medicine, which is, well, give me something to work on the symptoms. So that's so there's a bit of mindset in there. It's trying to get people to look at symptoms as helpful messengers rather than looking at them as evil invaders. So that's the first kind of chunk of my work. But it then goes into, again, like I touched on in the last show, this idea of, well, where does my experience come from? Because if my body is stressed, and if there's a big chunk of emotional stress in that, what gives rise to that experience? So I do take people on something of a spiritual journey, which is begin to have them understand or expand their sense of identity, who they see and believe themselves to be in relation to kind of life and all that is.
Sounds, here's the cool thing about this is, if you're hungry, right, you say to somebody, eat, not take a pill. Typically, it wouldn't be, let's take a pill for that to suppress the hunger pangs. Although we do that in Western society and Western medicine a lot, is, do something, take something in order to suppress. If you got a headache and it's because you haven't had enough water, you've been drinking too much soda, I wouldn't say take a migraine pill for that headache. I'd say drink some water and you'll take care of the cause of the symptom. And we do a lot, you mentioned a little bit, I mean, in our Western medicine thinking, we do a lot of symptom control versus root cause control. And by doing that, we can suppress symptoms, but cause the root, make the root cause get worse and worse and worse, which is why we have this massive deterioration of health over the years. And I like your analogy of walking down the hall, because, as I picture people piling on their symptoms as they walk down the hall, I also picture that picture of man going from straight up and starting to bend over and bend over and bend over. And it's the weight of all of these symptoms that are causing us to, all of a sudden, you get 80 years old and you're staring at your feet. You can't look up anymore because your back is too arched. And we didn't do anything to take care of the cause. We only were treating symptoms, and it just kept piling up. So
the final sort of interesting piece on that, well, for me, it's sort of interesting, on that, the hallway of health idea, is that what I'm trying to do is have people turn around and walk back down the hallway. And the interesting bit I think about that is that it's very often the case that as people go back down the hallway back towards health, is that the pattern of symptoms often kind of reverses itself. So if I have someone that says, well, actually, the first sort of symptom I had was sleep disturbance, then it's very often that either sleep disturbance reappears or is the last symptom to go. Or if somebody says, well, I used to have anxiety before I had chronic fatigue, I used to have anxiety. Very often people say, oh, well, I've had a month of no chronic fatigue-like symptoms of aches, pains, brain fog, but what I have had is a returning of my anxiety. And I'll say, well, that's a good thing, because you're walking back down the hallway of health. So that's a sort of, I think that's kind of an interesting idea, that And particularly, one of the things I emphasize to my clients is that the message behind the symptom may not be drastically different. So when you had mild headaches, whatever it was 20 years ago, maybe the message was exactly the same as it is now. You're kind of wiped out with chronic fatigue, 20 years later. What we tend to do, I think unconsciously, is we equate the necessary size of the solution to the size of the problem. So if I've got really big symptoms, there's got to be a really big cause, and that, in my experience, that isn't necessarily the case. It could be that actually what's happened is the body is just shouting a little bit louder and a little bit louder. And if we can understand what that is, that causes, because the difficulty is, I can see the difficulty is, as you said, with a headache can mean just so many different things. And of course, the type of health practitioner you go to is going to be viewing your symptoms from their perspective. So this is one of the things that I find is the majority, because not many people have heard of me, the majority of people I work with will have seen 3, 4, 5, up to 10 different health practitioners before they've seen me. So they will have worked on diet, they will have had acupuncture, they may have had some counselling. So there'll be a number of things they will have worked on. So that again is probably why, even though I believe that, well, nutrition, sleep, exercise, emotion, these are all the pillars of health. Very often the people that I work with have addressed the other areas first, and they're still missing that big emotional piece, which I feel is the kind of the main piece. And I think the kind of the adverse childhood experiences research, ACEs, known about childhood trauma, has really brought to the fore this connection between mind and body, and how trauma and emotional trauma in early life, and probably any point in life, can ultimately lead to a whole host of things, from poor educational attainment through to addiction, through to mental health problems, through to diabetes, stroke, cancer, heart disease. So I think that's kind of opened up people's eyes, because it seems that more people are aware of this, because trauma is such a buzzword now, isn't it, within health?
Yeah, it is a buzzword. However, here's my question to you. Somebody's walking down the road. They get a twinge. They don't notice the twinge, or they notice it as a subtle thing and they ignore it. Then they continue to walk. And we'll say that they're walking down a really long hallway, because it takes time. So year-long hallway, right? And then it gets to a place where it's unignorable. How can somebody acknowledge what's happening before it becomes unignorable?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, actually, and that was one of the things that, because I started my career working in business consulting, went into healthcare, and now I kind of do both, where I do kind of well-being stuff within organizations. But what I found is that the fundamental principles that underpin effective performance, mental clarity, and all that kind of stuff are sort of the same for health, certainly from an emotional perspective. So I think the key thing is being more body aware and recognizing that actually my body has my back. My body, this vehicle that I'm moving around this planet on, actually is trying to look after me. And rather than, if I can allow myself to step out, if I can recognize that, right, well, there is one way of dealing with things, and that's trying to just crack on, soldier on, patch up, put a band-aid over it. That's one way of dealing with things. But actually, for my longer term experience of life, my well-being, my performance, my health, I'm better off actually paying attention. If something's not quite right, just let's have a look at it. And let's just pause for a minute and figure that out. So again, it's I suppose it's having the knowledge that if I don't pay attention to it now, there's every chance, and if I don't know what it is, there's every chance that it could just get worse and worse and worse. So it's that stop, pause, pay attention to what's going on, and be okay with whatever it is. Whatever, you know, the thing I preach to my clients is whatever you feel in your body is feedback, and it's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. It's something for you to pay attention to, because it's your body trying to tell you something. And is that, again, as I've been saying, that message of, right, well, if you don't pay attention to it now, there's every chance your body will punch you in the face with something nasty later.
Yeah, you know, that is really the key here, is if you don't pay attention now. So to build more body awareness, in our last episode, one of the things that you had suggested was stopping to breathe more. I have another kind of a question that goes alongside that. Mental toughness versus emotional and physical awareness. Because some people believe that if they're going to be tough, then they have to, as you said, soldier through the pain. How does soldiering through the pain make you weaker, not tougher, and being more aware of what's going on cause you to be stronger as a human being, as a person, more optimal, etc.?
That's a great question. I think one of the fundamental underpinning pillars, if you will, of my work is that when we deviate from the essence of who we are, the flow of energy, the flow of consciousness that we are, I would say our true self, when we deviate from our true self, then problems ensue, and that's when we can become ill. And I recognize that sounds reasonably woolly, but you know, okay. Part of that is when we don't allow ourselves to feel our feelings, feel our emotions, and all the rest of it. So at one level, I would say, okay, well, I can go to the gym, and you know, and deep down, I feel I want to go to the gym. I want to work out. I want to be fit. I want to be strong, and that feels right. That's me being me doing that. It doesn't matter what anyone else thinks, but that's me being me. And I'm prepared to kind of push myself and exert myself, and some of that's going to hurt, and I might require what would be called mental toughness in order to push myself through over some hurdles. But in doing that, I would hope that I'm very aware of the difference between kind of good pain and bad pain. But also I'm in doing that, I'm still aligned with my true self. So I'm not, you know, I'm doing whatever I'm doing because I'm being me in doing it. I think that we have a natural innate resilience within us, but I think we have to be true to ourselves. That's a deeper sense of self than, you know, I think we need that. Otherwise, I think if our behavior is motivated by our egoic mind or our conditioning or pleasing other people, whatever it is, when our behavior is motivated from that level and we're trying to be tough for that level, then I think that's when we have problems. So I think there's always needing to be, you know, as you know, there's needing to be aware of whether something is good or bad. You know, I know if I'm in the gym and I'm working out, I know the difference between the good pain and the bad pain. So we absolutely need that. We need to be aware of, okay, well, is there an issue here? But for me, that's the thing with mental toughness. I think that, again, because of my work, I'm very, you know, because of a lot of my work is about our emotion. And there's lots of theories of emotion, so there's no particular agreement on it. I'm quite a fan of the neurologist Antonio Damasio, and one of his ideas is that, well, our emotion and our feelings are slightly different. Our emotion is a non-conscious process which then almost instantaneously triggers feelings. So I draw on that idea, and when I apply it to my work, I look at it from the perspective of, right, well, we know that it's entirely possible for us to block feelings. We know it's possible for us to get into our head, and if we get into our head, we can shut off from the feedback from our body, so we can block out feelings. But even if we block out feelings, we're probably not blocking the emotional processes and processing that's happening. So emotion is kind of still ongoing, because emotion, just like hunger needs to happen to alert you to when you need to eat, because of course there are people, and I've worked with people that say they're not aware of when they're hungry because they've learned to block out a lot of that feedback. So we can do that with our emotional feelings, but we're not blocking out the emotion. The emotion's still kind of going. So that's one of my issues with mental toughness in a kind of a conventional way of, right, we'll just soldier on, as I was saying earlier, is that you run the risk of just blocking out your emotional truth. Now, critically for me, that's about, right, well, who I am. If I'm doing something for the wrong reasons, then it'll come back and bite me on the ass later. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, and it kind of goes along with the saying that a warrior's greatest strength is their vulnerability. And in today's day and age, we've gotten away from, in some cases, that, which I believe is part of the causes of massive PTSD amongst our soldiers, is because we've gotten to this place where our warriors, it's not okay for them to express their emotions and their feelings. They have to soldier on, and therefore they've become less able or capable of dealing with some of those emotions long term and some of the experiences long term, because they don't have their comrades, their other soldiers next to them, being vulnerable with them. And I think in some cases it's moving back a little bit towards that, but in more of an older time, a soldier that was injured or was experiencing something had all of the other soldiers to be there directly, provide that community support, which allowed them to soldier on. The vulnerability was their greatest strength because it brought them closer as a unit, right? And so I believe that, with PTSD and some of these other things, that we could use more emotional intelligence and community support around the vulnerability aspect during the crises or directly after, so that we don't have to bring them home with us because we've been stuffing it for a year or two. You know what I mean?
Oh, totally. There's a couple of points I'd like to make with that. So I think that firstly, I think that we probably have a tendency to medicate people too quickly and believe that there is a problem too quickly. So if a person loses a family member, for example, they will go through a grieving process, and we understand that there is a grieving process which could give rise to anger, depression, anxiety, a whole host of emotions and possibly symptoms that could arise as a result of that process. Now, see, I view that because I think that we have an emotional system reset. So I think that we are designed to come back into balance in exactly the same way as our physical body does that. If you're running down the road and you fall over and you graze your knee, it really hurts. But you know that if you do absolutely nothing, your knee will heal itself. Yes, it goes through a process where a scab forms over the, and that's really itchy and you want to pick at it, but ultimately if you leave it be, your knee will heal. So understanding, part of the kind of idea of the scab forming and the healing and it being itchy and it being uncomfortable, and there's an emotional equivalent to that. So I think if you're getting over trauma, there is, you kind of go through a process and understanding that. So for me, that's kind of important. One of the things that I say in my corporate work is that when I talk about resilience, I say people that are resilient, it's not that they don't feel anything. It's not that they're like really happy all the time. They feel everything. So, which is exactly the point you just made, is being vulnerable and allowing that is really important. So 18 months ago, I went through divorce. It was all a big shock for me. It was devastating. It put me on the floor. But I really had to kind of walk my talk and recognize that I've gone through a process of trauma here, and that's going to mean that there's going to be my emotional experience and my my kind of health is going to be impacted to a certain extent. So I need to expect things to happen. But crucially, that emotional system reset will kick in as long as I get on with life. So I think it's really important that we continue to move forward with a sense of purpose, with a sense of meaning, and recognize that, well, yeah, even in moving forward, I'm going to be experiencing stuff, and that's okay. If I stop moving forward and I fixate on the fact that if I was like, oh no, I don't feel good, this isn't happening, this shouldn't be happening, maybe I should take some drugs, I think that's when things begin to go wrong. I think I think people are far more resilient than we currently have them believe. I think the experience of life at the moment is that, and we get this I think a lot with young people, is that there is this sense that you've not only got to have a nice car and a nice job, you've got to be crushing it, you've got to be having a good time all of the time. And I think the problem with that is that there is a lack of tolerance for what are the ups and downs of life. Life is filled with ebbs and flows, and there's bliss and happiness, and there's loss and sadness, and all the rest of it. And part of being a human being is having the experience of all of those, the fact that we can experience those contrasts. And isn't it wonderful that we can? And none of it is a problem if we allow ourselves to recognize, well, all of that naturally flows. If we don't label it, if we don't judge it, it will naturally flow. And it's not that it's a problem. As I say, I think that too quickly we get in and we look at it as this is a problem. So I agree with that thing on PTSD. I've not really done any work with PTSD with soldiers, but I'm really curious. I would be really curious if the support was there, the camaraderie was there, in whether that's in the forces or whether it's out, when they're kind of back home, and even if they're back on Civvy Street, but also whether if they're having this, if they're engaged in something which enables them to feel a sense of meaning and purpose, and then they feel they're moving forward in their lives, I think that they can, the chances of going through the ups and downs, the healing process, are facilitated. But if there's there's something not quite right here, and if they're not engaged in anything that enables them to get that meaning and purpose out of life, I think then the problems can ensue. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have worked a lot with PTSD with vets, and I used to volunteer at the VA in Los Angeles and worked a lot with Vietnam vets and so on. And, there was a huge difference between the vets from the Korean and World War II versus Vietnam and after. And I think that in many cases, it goes along with the ending of things like the block party. In the United States, a lot of neighbors don't know their neighbors anymore. A lot of people don't know what's going on with the people next door. And, I say the block party as kind of a metaphor for tribes, for people getting together and learning about each other and becoming friends and support systems and so on. I mean, especially for men, and I'm not going to say this as exclusive to men, but men tend to believe that they don't need anybody or anything more than women. Women always say, oh, we need our sewing circle, we need our, and sewing circle, reading circle, or support system, etc. It's a little more natural for women to be amongst other women, and it's a little more natural for men to be in their cave. And I'm going to go in my cave, I'm going to lick my wounds myself, right? And when I'm ready, I will then come back out. But we used to have a lot of men in the cave. We used to have rituals for men more that would initiate them into a tribe, right? And the tribe has been diminishing the tribal versions of getting together. To get together nowadays seems to be, let's go get a drink and dinner, and then, and chat about whatever, beating around the bush, so to speak, small talk, but not very in depth. That we save the in depth for maybe if we choose to go to a psychologist, or if we choose to go to a therapist, which still is not necessarily a support system. And so that's where I believe the work needs to be done more, is in creating systems where we can get together and discuss our emotional intelligence and discuss our philosophies. And, I had a very similar experience as you in the last year and a half, divorce. And I probably did the opposite of you. I went into my cave and I fought myself for a long time. And I never felt like I had my tribe, because my tribe to me it was in Los Angeles. And so they're not next to me. They're not here with me. They can't come over and comfort me and listen to me while I'm screaming and crying. So I'm just going to do that myself. And I probably would have had a much more effective part of that year and a half had I reached out more and said, I need help. I am in this place of vulnerability and I need help. And that is such a difficult thing for me to do, for most people to do. So what would you say? I know what I say to people who do that. Get over yourself and start calling people, your first friend. But what would you say to somebody who's going through such a tough time that it's affecting their physical health, their mental health, etc.?
Well, I would, as a first step, pretty much the same as you're saying there, to be honest with you, because I think there is that, again, polyvagal theory is pretty big now in trauma, and because one of the things that talks about is really when you look at how that translates into every practice, it's like, well, the most important thing is the relationship between the therapist and the client, which is all about connection. So that says, right, well, we can regulate ourselves through breathing, but very often we regulate each other through connecting to each other. We're social beings, we need to connect. And I think so I agree completely with what you're saying. Another thing I would say over here is that men used to go to the pub probably much more than they do. So I think, you've got that thing that you don't have the sense of community so much. You do in little places, but a lot of the time not so much. So people, as you say, people don't know their neighbors, and people don't go out so much. People don't go out for a beer or whatever it is. So the shared experiences are not necessarily there. So I would say as a starter, exactly the same as you, because I do think that intuitively that's what people want to do. It's just that, of course, historically those support systems, those connections, they were just already in place. You don't have to think about it. Whereas, of course, now we do have to think about it. So that it's recognized. I think a lot of what I do is trying to get people to tap into what feels right for them. So I would do what I could through a coaching session to invite somebody to allow their natural intuitive sense to come to the fore. My sense of it is that when that happens, that people would say, well, I want to reach out, I want to connect, I want to feel that everything's either is okay or is going to be okay. So it's okay. Well, how can we do that? So it is a case of reaching out and then explaining as well that, right, well, if you're kind of going into your cave, and I think women do this as well, and I think probably more so maybe now that there are probably more women that are and I don't know if I may be wrong with this, but my sense is that the way things have been historically, that certainly within in organizational world, things that I see is that very often women take on more of a masculine energy a little bit more in order to try to facilitate their journey or their career path. So I think that you can get women with their balance of masculine and feminine energy, maybe they display some more masculine traits, they may well go into themselves. And I think, again, is for me, it's sort of an educational process of identifying, well, what's the result of that? How are you feeling, and what's, how long have you been feeling like this? Are things improving, or are you, how is that working out for you, kind of thing? And well, this may be an alternative, because understanding that this is where we came from. We came from that space where we connected, we regulate each other through connection. It's naturally, from primates through to humans, it's naturally what we do. This is one of the things that's been interesting about COVID, isn't it? Is that with the social distancing and people being locked in their homes, is that naturally we want to touch people. We want to, because that's what we regulate each other through that. We want to hug, we want to connect, and that's, it's naturally what children will do. We'll see. So we all really want to do that, but it's allowing that natural kind of tendency to come out. So I suppose that's probably a big part of what I do, is trying to get people to recognize that, who they are, but also their natural sense of what feels right for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've mentioned our new world. I try to stay a little bit away from the debates about COVID, because my opinion is typically more nuanced rather than extreme, and more based in science rather than in politics. So I try to stay away from it a little bit. But the fact of the matter is that distance makes for people to what's our suicide rate at this point? It's skyrocketed. That is a stress response to isolation and lack of connection, and that alone is so damaging. But one of the things that I like to do, and you do a lot of corporate work as well as I have, is I used to consult the companies both on their wellness as well as their culture. And one of the things that my suggestion is to them is that they begin to have fireside or fire circles. And what I mean by fire circle is you put something in the middle that is like a focal point of energy. And I call it a fire circle because that's more of a tribal way of looking at life. And you take a company and you take the employees and you put them in circles of care, so to speak, so they can actually say, here's what I'm doing, here's what's stressing me out, here's the things I'm going through in life. And they say don't mix your business and your personal life, but when you're at work 8 to 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, your life is your business. Your personal and your business are the same. And so this is a way that we can kind of come back to that tribal kind of community where we have the support system of our fellow employees who probably are experiencing a lot of the same things that they're not talking about. And, the biggest cost to any company is what's called presenteeism, which is the stress that causes somebody to be at work and not be productive at all. They're basically absent, even though they're physically there. And that's caused 100% by stress and lack of focus due to other focused, meaning your issues, your problems. And so it behooves a company tremendously financially to take the opportunities to shift their perspective from hard costs, right? And say, okay, we're going to take a day, maybe once a quarter, maybe, twice a quarter, to really get our employees on the same page with each other so we all know what we're struggling with and we can be of support. What are some of the ways that you have worked with companies to take care of their stress responses and their employee health?
I mean, I think that, what you've talked about there is such a great idea. And it's interesting going back to what you said before, you were saying that about culture. I think that's the kind of the starting point. It's a really interesting thing within the organizational world when you're looking at well-being, I find, because there are those organizations that recognize that, well, yeah, if we look after our employees, they'll be productive, they'll be happy, they're going to stick with us, they're going to build careers here. And that's brilliant. But it's almost like the culture, that top-down culture is in place where at the top they're buying into that notion that well-being and productivity and engagement are all linked. And because you get those organizations where they thinking, right, well, yeah, people seem to be stressed, so let's just try to do something, or let's even tick a box. So let's get a guy in to run a workshop and to just try to kind of, give people some tools that they can deal with their stress. So the first thing is always trying to, I suppose, enlighten organizations that, okay, we can do so much with your staff, and what I'm always looking to do there is empower people to understand again, talk about emotion, talk about stress, talk about what they can do. But critically, unless we're looking at how that cultural piece, then it's not going to work. Also, I think the other thing is that it's really interesting what you're kind of talking about, because I've been in that example, the kind of the fire pit example, is that I've been to a few organizations where they've brought me in because they think, right, well, we got people off on stress, we better run a workshop on stress. So let's get a guy in, get him to run. We can teach people about stress, because they may have bought an off-the-shelf kind of stress workshop, but I'll go in and I'll try to tease out, well, what does this mean? What actually is going on? What does stress mean to this organization? How are people affected? And it's not uncommon for it to be things like, oh, actually, we used to run meetings. We used to have this big team meeting like once a month. But we sort of stopped doing that now. So because people are on the road a lot, people are not talking to each other as much. And Bob in this team doesn't know what Dave is doing or Sally is doing. And therefore, do you know what I mean? And then it can be, well, actually, maybe because we thought that meeting was just time consuming, pulling people in off the road, it actually was hugely beneficial, because even though it was kind of work related, it did give people that opportunity to talk about, well, everything that was going on for them. So it's very much the same thing, I suppose, it's because we need to be connected, we need to be talking. And I think as well, that other point you made is that one of the things I've noticed, going back 25 years, I think when I started my career within organizations, there was much more of a division between, right, well, this is work life and this is home life. At work, we talk about work, we talk about your skills, we talk about your training. If there's anything about outside work, we're not interested. And for years, I was bleating on about, well, a person is a person. So if somebody's got shit going on, then they're gonna bring that to work. It's going to be affecting them at work. It could even be something very simple. You could have people that maybe they don't realize that how important sleep is, and they're up on their Xbox till 2 a.m. every morning, and then they're getting up at 6 to work. And if they're working on a job that is required, that may impact the lives of others, maybe they're working on a rail network on a road, or maybe they just, do you know what I mean? It could be anything like that. And if they're doing something which is impactful, and therefore their performance is affected by what the amount of sleep they're getting at home, simply informing them of that is useful. But we've got to know what they're doing at home first. So we've got to know that, well, this person is a person, they've got a home life which will be affecting, however simple the solution may be. There's a home life, and there's, that's going to affect them. So I think it's really important that people, because managers talk about this now as well, they say, oh, I find that I'm managing now, and I'm almost got to be a friend, because, well, especially if I've got an older manager, and he'll say, well, 30 years ago, you tell people to get on with it, and you assess whether they've got the skills or the training needed. But now, he said, they'll say, well, I'm talking about much more than just the skills. And I think so that, organizations, I think, are opening up to that, but that's incredibly important. And it is finding some way of bringing in your kind of, fire pit, fireside idea where people can get together, have an opportunity to share, to vent if need be, to talk, to understand, to process, to decompress, all of those things. And in the absence of that, yeah, that's just going to be, it's a huge issue.
Yeah, I used to be part of a group called the Spark Group, which was based on the old Marx groups of the late 60s and early 70s. It was very, very hippie culture-ish. But we had a process, sorry, we had a process called withhold. And you're sitting in a circle and you would say something along the lines of, Kyle, I've been withholding something from you. And you'd either say something positive or something negative, right? I've been withholding something from you. I really enjoyed our conversation the last time. And I so was looking forward to having you come back on. And I'm sorry that it's taken so long. That's an example of like a positive withhold. A negative withhold, Kyle, your accent, I just want to tell you, it's like chalkboard, fingernails on a chalkboard, right? Whatever it is, it could be deeply personal or it could be, but the point is that you're sharing with somebody something that you wouldn't normally share with them, which then draws you into them and allows you to become closer with that person. Either way, because now it's out in the open and you get to, express it, and then it can dissipate because there's awareness that's been brought to it. And that kind of a thing to me is such an important, valuable aspect to de-stressing yourself. And anytime I've gotten away from doing that and being that kind of honest, it's bit me in the butt, including things like, divorce and so on. I've been such a self-enabled person most of my life that it's hard for me to ask for help when I need it. And that has caused much of the trauma that I've experienced in life, is not the traumas, but not being able to ask or express the trauma after it's occurred has caused more trauma than the actual trauma has. So you deal a lot with debilitating symptoms, and a lot of that comes from stress and trauma. So what would you say to somebody who has been dealing with chronic pain for a while, comes into your office and says, I've got this chronic pain. It's made me have mental fog and mental fatigue. And so now I just don't know what to do. I'm really tired and I don't sleep and I'm tired and I'm not sure what to do. What would be your initial response to somebody like that and advice?
So once we've got over the first bit of understanding what the diagnosis is, so say, for example, somebody was coming in and saying, well, I've got fibromyalgia, so there's nothing structurally wrong. I've been diagnosed, but I have presenting symptoms. I've had them for a period of time, and this is the diagnosis I've had. So I have a plethora of symptoms: muscle aches and pains, brain fog, fatigue, all the rest of that. So there will be some of those symptoms that will arise as a result of having symptoms. And we need to understand that. The first thing I'm doing is going back to what we were saying right at the start, is I'm trying to offer people a perspective on what might be causing symptoms. So I will be saying, okay, well, my approach is that this is what's causing fibromyalgia. It's caused by a body and a brain that is, in a very simple way, is stuck in a state of stress. And that leads, there's this chain reaction that takes place, which results in symptoms. So we have to come back and look at the symptoms as useful messengers. And people with fibromyalgia and similar conditions will experience fluctuations in symptoms. So most people will experience a baseline level of symptoms that seem to be ever present, and then symptoms that go up and come down over and above that. And I will say, well, what's happening is that when you notice an increase in symptoms, and it may be that you try to tune out from it because they seem to be there all the time, but we need to tune back in because we're approaching it from the perspective of my body's trying to tell me something. When you notice that increase in symptoms, we want to translate that back into a message. And in many instances, it's something to do with emotion, what's happened to our emotion, and then there's a behavioral implication of that. So it's either about emotion, or I'm kind of, if the way I phrase it, I'm deviating from the flow of my true self. The idea being that there's this part of us that just wants to be who we are, to flow, and if that is inhibited, then problems will ensue. So that's how I start, and it's, again, very often when people have symptoms of either chronic fatigue or chronic pain, they are looking to give me something to manage my symptoms, and it's that I need to manage my life. My symptoms have got worse. It's 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon. I was kind of okay. In the last half an hour, I noticed my symptoms get worse. Oh crap, that's going to mean X, Y, Z. I need to get home. I need to lie down. So I'm turning that around and say, okay, well, you might be that your body's not necessarily telling you to rest. It may be, so we need to have a look at what's going on, both externally and internally, so we can understand, well, what might the message be behind those symptoms. And as I say, this is why the diagnosis is important, because when the symptoms are, come under that category of medically unexplained, invisible, functional, those sorts of things, then I am coming from it from the perspective of, all right, well, it means that my little way of looking at it is saying, but we've got a stress bucket, and the stress bucket is overflowing. And I say that stress bucket is, what goes in there can be environmental, physical, emotional, even though most of what I'm looking at is the deeper, more complex emotional patterns. It's I am factoring in that thing of, well, if you've had a transatlantic flight and you've had 8 beers on that flight, there's a lot, that's in your stress bucket, so we have to factor that in. So if you're more prone to symptoms, if you get to the hotel the other side and your room's not ready, that might be the final little piece which triggers massive symptoms for you. Had you not had a transatlantic flight and those 8 beers, it could be that that little upset of your room not being ready, if you're local, that may have not triggered some symptoms for you. So it's trying to decipher in that way, but in many instances it's a bigger emotional piece. But that's to say, that's how I approach it. Is from there, when people begin to say, oh yeah, actually, because initially people will say, oh, I get my symptoms all the time, and I say, well, let's just have a deeper look. And then they'll say, well, actually, yeah, no, symptoms do increase. I do get times when they're worse. So then we begin to get, there are patterns. So everybody will have, there are kind of key triggers which relate to what I think are deeper life lesson issues, if you will, for each person. So most people will have between 3 and 5 kind of key triggers, which are emotional triggers for them, that ultimately lead to symptoms. And then the difficult work is then is dealing with that. Sometimes it is a simple acknowledgement of emotion and of a behavioral change. Other times it can connect with that deeper sense of self and how I see myself in relation to the world. And that's a little bit harder. A little bit harder to deal with, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's awesome. And so how I relate to some of what you just said is I look at life on a physical, energetic, emotional level, right? So if I'm watching a nervous system in my mind, the nervous system has a trigger that is a stressor, and the nervous system then lights up with electricity, starts sending chemical signals that cause inflammation to certain areas. That inflammation is the beginning of disease. And if you look at the locations of the nervous system that lights up, like somebody who has joint pain, you were talking about fibromyalgia, joint pain, is when you're in fight or flight, all of your blood flow goes into your extremities and out of your organs, thereby causing your organs to not work properly, especially if you're in chronic fight or flight. And it causes your muscles and your joints in your extremities to start having pain, symptoms of, over inflammation. You get joint pain, you get chronic fatigue, you get eventually fibromyalgia and things like that, because your nervous system is so inflamed and your body is in fight or flight, and the inflammation is spread out from there away from your organs, thereby causing your body to not function properly and causing your muscles and joints to have pain. So that's how I look at what you just said. It's my way of explaining in my own mind what you just said, and I hope that explanation kind of helps some of the listeners as well, if they're assessing, okay, so where's my body right now? What am I feeling? What is the trigger? And you can see somebody driving down the road and all of a sudden, somebody cuts them off. Is that a trigger for you? If it is, where do you feel it? And I think that this is one of the ways that people can begin to have that self-awareness that you keep talking about as it comes to stress symptom disease, basically.
Yeah.
Is that about
Oh
it?
yeah, no, I go with that totally. I think that my approach has been very much kind of at the coalface, if you will. So I've always been interested in trying to figure out what works for people. So there is a little bit of science in what I say, but I've always been much more focused on, all right, well, this is your experience. I'm I've got this simple scientific perspective. But what I focus all of my attention on is how can we make something practical out of that you can do something with, that is going to help you get to where you need to be. Because obviously there's huge debate about exactly what, when you've got people with chronic fatigue, ME, fibromyalgia, as to what exactly is going on, what's the cause, and all the rest of it. And you can get down a rabbit hole and get lost in all of that. And as I say, my focus has always been trying to get people into a process that seems to work. But yeah, no, I totally go with everything that you just said. That all sort of makes sense to me. I suppose I'm looking at it from, which again, it's theory, but the theory is, well, it's almost a little bit like, if that nervous system is just constantly ramped up. So rather, if on a scale of sort of 0 to 10, it sort of normally rests around a 3. It's almost like it's on a 7. So it's almost like you've already got your foot on the gas pedal. So it doesn't take much to spark something. And yeah, I'm looking for that emotional piece with that probably more often than not. But there's so much that I don't understand in terms of the intricacies of kind of what's going on at a cellular level within the body. But that just hasn't been my focus, really.
So you've been doing this a long time, and just as an example, as a story, tell us a story about a really great success that you had with somebody.
So a lady I had a while ago, I mean, when she first came to see me, she had fibromyalgia, and she'd said she was, she came in on a stick, and she said she had been out looking at probably needing to get a wheelchair. So she was with her partner, and she was in her 50s, and she said, I've had this for a number of years now. And it transpired that she'd been an alcoholic, or was an alcoholic, and had drunk for a lot of years, probably 20 years. And when she stopped drinking, which I think was something like had been 10 years prior to when I was seeing her, then the fibromyalgia came. So it's almost as if then she becomes aware of probably what was already there. And when she began to do the work, it was really interesting to me, because we talked about, I don't spend a lot of time talking about people's childhoods, but we talked a little bit about what life was like for her. And again, looking from a medical history perspective, just looking at her symptoms and when they first, what was it like? Did she get any symptoms when she was younger? But she told me about what her childhood was like, and it was pretty evident to me that she was bullied and emotionally abused, physically and emotionally abused, by both her mother and her older sister. But it was really interesting the way she talked about it, because she was talking about it in the same way as I'm talking to you now. There was nothing. She wasn't registering any emotion at all. It was a matter of fact. She was quite happy. She told me she felt sorry for them because they obviously weren't nice people. Now, of course, my perspective is that, well, what's happened is, in order to get through that trauma as a child, she kind of shut off. And we know this happens, don't we? We kind of shut off from those emotional processes, and that becomes a learned pattern then. So as she goes through life, everything is shut down, or her emotional side is kind of shut down. And again, from this metaphorical perspective of, well, the body is trying to tell you something. It's right. Well, the emotion is shut down, so the body's now sending symptoms to say you're not feeling your emotion. You need to feel the emotions you have. So I invited her to take a note of symptoms, as I said, the ups and downs of when, and with the idea that, well, there's a message there. And when she came back to me for the second session, the first thing she became aware of was all of the emotion that she actually felt about her mother and her sister. And again, that wasn't the focus of the exercise. The focus of, right, well, there's probably emotion that you're not feeling. That's one of the fundamental things, is that the body's sending a symptom because the emotion is not being felt. Because again, going back to what I was saying earlier, we know we can block our feelings, but the emotion is still going. So if there are symptoms there's every chance you might not be feeling any emotion underneath. We're just going to assume that it's there and not being felt. So that was the first thing, was that she was kind of overwhelmed with, oh my God, I obviously do feel a lot of anger about, what happened. But then crucially, this is where the work kind of stepped in, was that she developed those patterns of blocking how she really felt. So we had to look at when symptoms are cropping up, and then how does this relate to today, tomorrow, and the next day? What was going on at 3:30 on a Thursday afternoon? Who was there? What was going on? What might the emotions have been that the body was trying to kind of get through because they weren't being felt? So that takes a period of time, because it's uncovering, and then it's all right. Well, what do I do instead? If I've been like this for kind of 20, 30 years, how do I change that? But I do remember being on vacation with my family in Spain. I don't know, in that summer, and getting a text message from her saying that she just completed a local kind of park run, a kind of a 5K sort of fun run. She said, I walked most of it, but she said, I did some jogging. And she said, just to think that, when I came to see you first, I was looking to get a wheelchair because I was having increasing problems walking and could only walk kind of, 10, 15 steps. So that's a great success. I think the thing with that is one of the difficulties, I think, with the work that I do is that cause and effect are not necessarily closely linked. I think intuitively people know this. Go back to, when you said a headache and, well, you might need to drink more water. I think people can see that. Well, I got a headache. I'm probably dehydrated. Yeah, probably, or I've had too much caffeine, so I'm probably cut back on the Coke. Let's get some water, and that makes sort of sense. People can buy that. But if you say, well, actually, there's a bunch of emotion going on here that you're not feeling, and your body's trying to tell you with a headache. I think at one level people sometimes know, because it's not uncommon for people to say, oh God, I got a stress headache after a terrible day at work, and I think they can understand that. The interesting thing, if that headache becomes chronic and you've got a headache for quite a bad headache, and you're waking up with that headache, it's not going away, and it's there for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a month, you're then thinking, oh shit, I better go and see my doctor now. And then the doctor's going to go, on, you probably want to take some pills for that. So even though intuitively to begin with, they probably knew that, well, yeah, I'm just massively frustrated. By then just going home and having a glass of wine or taking some whatever they take, by not actually addressing what's going on there. And that's the tricky thing, is it's not easy to address what's going on here. Is there some action I need to take because I feel this level of frustration or whatever it is? Or does this say something about my model of reality? Is this something about my expectations, the meaning I place on life? Do we need to look at that? And that's the kind of the deeper stuff. I suppose that's what a lot of my work is about. Is there's behavioral changes that people make, but there's also that other stuff, which is who I feel I am in relation to work and my boss and whatever it is. And therefore, what needs to change in order to get this me flowing and get my emotion flowing? But that's not easy work to do. And as I say, that cause and effect seem to be a little bit further apart. So yeah. That's always stuck with me, that lady, because I just remember being on vacation, seeing that text message, and thinking, just know that's what this is all about.
Absolutely. I love that. And so I like to take this to a little bit more of a 30,000 foot view. Systemically, societally, right? I always talk about things like medicine began with infrastructure. We created aqueducts and things to move waste away from neighborhoods in order to keep people from getting sick because they were sleeping next to pig poo. I mean, this is the reason for infrastructure at the beginning was a medical system. It was like, okay, you're sleeping next to the feces, you're getting sick. Okay, let's move that away from where you're sleeping and living. So aqueducts and infrastructure was created, and I have a theory that we have, with all of our roads and air travel and noise and bombardment of radio waves and et cetera, that we have infrastructurally created a system that causes more stress and more illness rather than helping to alleviate. And the other part of that theory is that we made this shit up and we can do better. So why don't we start looking at how do we create a system that causes less stress and is more in harmony and in balance with nature? So if you're going to look at from a 30,000 foot view and go, I'm looking down on the world going, what can we do as a society to begin the process of reconstructing how we've created this society and build one that is more attuned with nature and alleviates stress? What would be your thoughts? And I know this is like an out of the blue, not something that you probably have heard a question like that before, but
no, I haven't. But my sense of it probably starts with, it does start with parenting, really, and it starts with the things that we teach our children. I agree completely with what you say, from that perspective of, well, the sorts of illnesses that we were dealing with a couple of hundred years ago are entirely different from the sorts of illnesses that we're dealing with now. Most of the chronic health challenges we're facing now are lifestyle health issues. So yeah, we've created something around convenience and a pleasure fix without a deeper understanding of kind of who we are. So I think from a younger age, we need to be introducing some of the ideas of, who are we? Where does our experience come from? What's of value and what's important? Even simple things like connection. But for me, empowerment is crucial, and having people own their experience and be honest with that. So I think we should be teaching kids these things. It's the way I parent. I've got two daughters that are 15 and 17, and I've done my best to kind of to empower them with, to kind of own their feelings, to express their feelings, to walk there and stand in their own truth. And I think that's kind of what we should be doing from that, because the young people then, I think they'll come up with ideas of the kind of the complex stuff that we need to do with society as a whole. I think the kind of the factory line approach to education for me is not worked. The left brain focus of teaching kids a bunch of facts that they then regurgitate for exams. I don't know how different it is over there, but I know what it's like over here. Kids are taught to pass exams, really, and they kind of learn stuff to pass exams. So that's for me. It starts with children, but it's I mean, parenting as well. I know that's a big thing, isn't it? But I think that people just have kids, and I don't know how much they think about how they parent, but you could argue that a huge proportion of the issues that we face are parenting issues. But on a completely different note, there's an argument to say statistically, when it comes to well-being and health, the key would be don't be poor, because the statistics would suggest that, right, well, those people that are living in poverty, the kind of the metrics for health are far worse. So if there was a basic universal living wage, that could go some way, to help people get out of poverty. That might improve health outcomes, and there's a lot of it's deep stuff, isn't it? And and I'm no expert on most of it.
Yeah, it is very deep. One of my mentors is Buckminster Fuller, and his work is, to me, pretty amazing. And one of the things that he is quoted, and I'm going to paraphrase because it's too long of a quote, but it's basically the auspicious notion that we need to work to be of value needs to end when there is 10,000 people that have the ability to create the technology that would support the rest of the world population. And so to work to be of value is a thing that we've created in our society. And because of that, we've created this massive amount of stress, because now we're not working for or towards our passions. We're working for or towards the ability to eat. We're working for or towards the ability to put shelter over our heads and to live at all. And that causes such a massive amount of stress that is completely unnecessary in a world that is abundant with shelter and food, right? So we've made it so food is not, at least in my area, they were talking a lot about not allowing you to make food in your own backyard, have an outdoor garden in your own backyard. To me, that's just because you might share it with a friend or a neighbor, and it may have some salmonella or some disease or some this or that. And so because you may share it with a friend and it's not just a personal consumption, they didn't want to allow that. And I say, there's like, you go down the road, right? And you see all these oak trees or pine trees or whatever trees. I'm like, if all we did is every other tree, we planted an orange tree, an apple tree, a pear tree, a plum tree, some berry bushes and stuff, you could walk down the road and eat. That's your real fast food, right? That's going to cause more health, less stress. If you were to do that in schools, right? You have community schools or community gardens inside of the school that feeds not only the school, but also teaches the kids about planting and nutrition and health and so on. This would be something that would be really beneficial. And I had an experience once, and I'll just kind of briefly tell you about it. I was working with my buddy Mike Torsha, who had started this project called the Shape Up America campaign. It was a project to nonprofit to help get kids healthier. And we went to New York City and we met with the New York City boards on for their schools for all of New York. So we were talking to the person that was in charge of all of New York's schools, and we had the funding, we had the vendors who were ready to put foods that are healthy and so on inside the schools, could create the gardens on top of roofs in some cases, because there's plenty of land everywhere, even if it's above, right? Or hydroponics, and so forth. So we had all of this prepared and ready, and we were just doing our proposal. And they said, we have a contract with a sugar company, and I'm not going to name the sugar company, but it's a pretty big company inside of New York City. And we're not allowed to give any foods with alternative to sugar. So it can't be an artificial sweetener like stevia or monk fruit or something healthy or even agave. It had to be sugar or a sugar substitute, right? And that was a statewide contract that they had. So they declined to help their students become healthier because of this agreement or contract they had with a sugar company. And I was thinking to myself, like, if only they could understand the logic or lack of logic that they just said to me, that they just talked about. What is wrong with this picture when money and contracts is more important than the health and living of our populace? And so it made me really think about, how do we create these systemic changes? And and in the systemic change of decreasing stress is probably the most important to our overall health that we can make.
I think there's a couple of things. I think the first thing you said about growing things in your garden, for me, that's nothing to do with potentially giving salmonella to your neighbor. That's all about control, isn't it? Because if you're self-sufficient, we don't own you. So whilst that's a conspiracy kind of notion, I think we all kind of know that big business runs the world, really. And again, that's the second thing that goes into the second piece, doesn't it? If people are self-sufficient, and there's those power structures are kind of brought down. Now, I think part of what's going on, I don't know where you stand with it, but I think part of what's going on at the moment is, I think we are going through a huge period of dramatic change. And I think that part of it is, there is a breaking down of the old. And we are, arguably it's a very exciting time, but whenever there is a period of going through change, whether it's an individual, whether it's a culture, whether it's a planet, there is a period of chaos or seeming chaos while there is this breaking down and rebuilding. And I think that's where we are right now. I think we're seeing transparency. I think we're seeing, the grip of the old ideas, of the old structures. I think that's kind of coming down, and we're witnessing it. So it's an exciting time to be around. But yeah, I think it's got to be, it's fundamental, isn't it? I think it's. I wondered whether things post-COVID might begin to go back to something a little bit more local. I mean, I know what it's like around here. People are buying things in local stores. So, their fruit and veg and their meat and whatever is locally sourced. So it would be nice to see a proliferation of that as we kind of move forward. But yeah, I think, we're in for a bit of a rocky road over the next couple of years, or a rocky ride. But hopefully, I'm very optimistic that there is this kind of global change in a positive way. I think the old guard will try to hang on to power, because those small number of people in power will want to hold on to their power. But I think ultimately that hopefully we will see a fundamental change we can look back in however many years time, 10, 20, 30 years, 40 years time, and look back and say, yeah, things really were changing then.
Yeah, I have a feeling that we are at this crossroads, and we can either choose to go with the status quo, or we could choose to go with a revolution. And it doesn't have to be a violent revolution, as we've been seeing with a lot of protests. It could be a peaceful revolution, but a revolution is what's needed. And, this show is called Create a New Tomorrow for a reason, because it's all about activating your vision for a better world. And, I'm starting a mastermind to go along with this kind of a philosophy, so that we can get people having these kinds of conversations on a regular basis that actually move forward society, that move forward people individually, communities locally, and society as a whole. And the idea is to really create this new tomorrow, to figure out, okay, we're in this transition period, and they're saying the new norm. Well, we don't want this to be the new norm, where we're socially isolated and having to cover our faces and not being able to hug and hold and so on. So we've got to figure out a new norm. And wouldn't it be awesome if that new norm was one that was in alignment with nature, that understood nature, and still allowed technology to move forward faster while being in harmony with nature? And so that's kind of my feeling, is like, how do we recreate this society? Because we did make it up. We created it. It's our imaginations that has developed every building that you see, every piece of legislation that came from us humans, right? It wasn't the monkeys, it wasn't the sharks, it wasn't the dolphins that created this. We created it. And I think people forget that we created this society, and we have the ability and opportunity at any given moment to shift and change what we've done and what we're doing for a more optimal response, to get better results, for higher and greater performance. And so that's really the basis of me wanting to do this show, for me wanting to have people like you on. And so I'm going to ask you, as I ask everybody, and I asked you in the last episode that we did together, what are 1 to 3 things that are actionable steps that somebody could actually take with them and do today, tomorrow, and the next day to improve their world, to create a new tomorrow for themselves and for the world that they live in?
Well, you're right. It does start with the individual, doesn't it? I think that I always like to kind of break things down into little chunks that we can do. So what I would say is, in the last show, I mentioned breathing, and we talked about the importance of coming back into the body and breathing. But I think that learning to feel is really important, and I think that the way we can do that is that, as a listener, you could say, right, I'm going to take 1 day, or I'm going to take 2 days, or I'm going to take a week. And what I'm going to do during that 1 day, 2 days, a week, I'm going to allow myself to be curious about how I feel, what I feel about things. Because there's an idea about what I like, what I don't like, and all that kind of stuff. But I'm going to allow myself to be curious. And when I experience maybe some uncomfortable feelings, I'm going to allow them to be there. Because what instinctively happens is that we experience some discomfort, anger, fear, sadness, whatever it is, frustration. And we instinctively block it. We try to push it aside, or we go into our head and we try to rationalize it away. So what I would say is take that period of time, 1 day, 2 days a week, and allow yourself to come into your body, be aware of feelings. And when you notice an uncomfortable feeling, just be aware of it and remind yourself that, it's perfectly okay for me to feel this feeling now. I can fully feel it, whatever it's like, tension or whatever, wherever it is. I can fully feel it. I can observe it. I can feel it. I can watch it and experience it. It's not a problem, and I don't have to solve this. Now, it may be that it's inviting me to take action, but critically, the first step is I can let myself feel this, and it's okay. What I feel is not a problem. I don't have to solve the feeling. Now, it may be that it just moves, or it may be that it moves you to do something. But honoring that, for me, that's kind of the first step, is that it's honoring your feelings, because so often we're labeling them. I don't want to be feeling this. I don't want to be the type of person that feels this. And quite quickly, because often what happens is emotion does lead to an increase in activity of within the thought centers of the brain. So usually what happens is that when we feel something, our thinking lights up, and we usually get caught in kind of mind loops. So coming out of the head, and it can be that you notice that your head goes first, and in those instances it's coming back into the body, because this is the advantage of breathing. When you learn to breathe, you're training yourself out of your head a little bit back into the body anyway. But that idea that, all right, well, let's just come back into the body, and as a first step, let me remind myself what I feel is, it's perfectly okay for me to feel this anger. This anger is not a problem. Okay, you can be, well, what, given I feel this, what is it I'd like to do? Is there anything I need to do? Is it prompting me to say something or to take some action? Or do I just need to allow myself to feel this without it being a problem? So that's my one major actionable step. And if as I say, if people did that, even if it's for a day, I would be interested to know what what the experience is from that, because there is that instinct to resist immediately. To tighten up, resist it, or chatter.
Yeah, absolutely. That whole being curious is also the same thing as becoming aware of. And when you become aware of something, it's like shining the light into the darkness. And so what I heard you just say, in my words, right, is shine the light into the darkness on your feeling and emotion so that you can recognize that it's there. A lot of people don't know when they're feeling angry, sad, grieving, emotional, or whatever. They just are feeling a stress, a distress, right? So, and the part that you said, not judging it, right? Not judging that feeling. It's okay that I'm angry. It's okay. I don't have to do anything with it. It's okay that I feel that. That is, to me, a brilliant, piece of advice for people. And then the only other thing that I would, I guess, want to add to that is, and you said this, is the now what, right? Now that I know this, what am I going to do with it? And I might go a little bit further and ask, when was the first time I felt this? Just as a curious question. When was the first time that I felt this kind of a feeling? And just so that my body can unravel the cord to the very beginning, it might have been when I was 3, it might have been when I was 2. Somebody said something that felt, mean to me, and then I just got reminded of it now. In healing, we always say that there's nothing that can happen to you now that is the cause of your feelings. It's all the memories of the first time it happened, the first time that trauma happened.
Yeah.
And so it's a really interesting thing that you were saying about recognizing, being curious. So
it is. I think that idea. So I think that idea of what I feel is not a problem is massive, because people immediately will be trying to rationalize away, trying to think it away, judging it. There's so many things, because it's no surprise, is it? Because according to science, as far as I'm aware, that the same areas of the brain light up when you experience an emotional pain as when you experience a physical pain. And we know that human beings are wired to try to get away from pain or dissociate from pain as quick as possible. So whether it be thinking my way out of it or trying to find meaning in it or whatever it is, or getting stuck in mind loops, or just resisting it or tensing up, whatever it is, there is that's usually what people are doing. There's something in down that avenue that they're taking. The idea of coming back and, do you know what? And what's interesting for me is that you'll have maybe the anger that you're feeling, which is uncomfortable, but then there's a whole layer of suffering that goes with that, with the resistance, and then the mental churning that associates that. And we can get rid of that suffering and come back to whatever the feeling is, simply by coming into the body and then being, okay, well, this is not a problem. It may be that I've got to turn around to my boss and say, well, actually, look, I can't take on that extra shift right now. So it may be that the frustration or anger is inviting us to do that. But critically, the first stage is always, this isn't a problem. The feeling is not a problem. It doesn't mean that, it may well be that there's a problem out there that I need to deal with, but that's what the emotion is for to a certain extent. It's potentially giving us a nudge.
Absolutely. And that is absolutely brilliant. And this has been an amazing conversation that we have, that we've been on. Nice journey of experience and discovering ways in which we can take our stresses and turn them into positive behaviors and positivity versus turning them inward into disease. And so I really appreciate you coming on and sharing this wisdom. How could people get a hold of you if they want to get a hold of you?
The website is energyflowcoaching.com. I'm on social media, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter as Energy Flow Coaching and Kyle Davies. So yeah, and I love talking about this kind of stuff. So if anyone is listening and is interested or has any questions, please do get in touch with me and ask me, because I'm more than happy to, fire you an email or even have a chat. So yeah, I think it starts with discussions like this, doesn't it? That's how our creativity comes from this, and then we share ideas and we develop new ones. And I think this sort of stuff is incredibly important. So thank you for having me on. Congratulations on this, because I think it's brilliant.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And just in case anybody is wondering, Kyle works with people in the UK, USA, Brazil, Canada, Argentina. I mean, anywhere in the world that you are, we have shrunk the world with Zoom. He is more than happy to be of service, and has been for a number 25 years now. So I look forward to having you on sometime in the future. And again, thank you for listening, and thank you for being here and taking your time to understand these things and have these conversations with us. I look forward to your comments. Thank you so much. Create a new tomorrow. I'm your host, Ari Gronich. Activate your vision for a better world and have a healthy day. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this podcast. I appreciate all you do to create a new tomorrow for yourself and those around you. If you'd like to take this information further and are interested in joining a community of like-minded people who are all passionate about activating their vision for a better world, go to the website createanewtomorrow.com and find out how you can be part of making a bigger difference. I have a gift for you just for checking it out, and look forward to seeing you take the leap and joining our private paid mastermind community. Until then, see you on the next episode.